The content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views, and opinions expressed herein, belong to the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of Brigham Young University or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Hi, I'm Dr. Leslie Hadfield, and I am an African history professor here at BYU in Provo. I did my PhD at Michigan State University, where I focused on African history. And when doing African history, we really use a lot of oral history. It's a very important part of understanding the African past, African perspectives, and uncovering history that hasn't been known before in a lot of ways. And because of that, I've done a lot with oral history in my different book projects. I have written about South African history. I have 2 books. The Liberation and Development book was my first book project, and that's on the Black consciousness movement of South Africa in the 1970s. I also wrote a book on nurses in South African history. A Bold Profession is the title for that book. And both of those projects, I interviewed a number of people, both activists in the anti-apartheid movement and nurses who worked in the rural Eastern Cape. I also have been working on research on the porters and guides who've worked on Mount Kilimanjaro, and again used oral history there. So oral history has been a very important part of my work. And because of that, I have also taught an oral history and family history class here at BYU. It's been one of my favorite classes to teach. And so as I present today, I will be referencing oral history, and I hope that you will watch other videos about doing oral history and family history. But hopefully you will see throughout this session today that oral history will play a part and really does correlate a lot with the other written records that we have. Fleshing out the history of our ancestors for both understanding them as individuals and for obtaining vital information requires using a number of different kinds of sources. And like I said, I want to address today how to analyze and interpret these sources in conjunction with each other, and to do it well, especially taking into account how oral history can interact with other sources. Conducting an oral history interview and collecting other historical sources or evidence is a major step in the process of constructing our understanding of what happened in the past. We can do interviews with people. We maybe find them in a census. We find information about them in birth records or death records. So collecting all of that and bringing it together is a very important part of the process. The next major step in understanding our family members in the past is evaluating those sources, interpreting them, and analyzing them so that we can find out what it is that we learn about them from these sources. And with all historical sources, both written sources and oral sources, there are various considerations that go into understanding what you can gain from the sources. For example, we have to assess reliability and validity with these sources. We have to look at the intended audience of these sources and the intended meaning that come through these messages versus what is not said. So there are things that people hold back or things that are missing from records, and sometimes that in and of itself, what is missing or what is not said, tells us about the past. With oral history and memoirs, we also have to consider memory, how we remember things, and emotion, what goes into those memories, how we feel about them years after the fact. We also need to consider who conducted the interview and under what circumstances. All of those things really have an impact on the information that come from oral sources. But again, if we ask these questions of all of our sources, it can really help us understand what we can gain and what further questions we may need to ask. And we can also uncover more information about our ancestors that we might otherwise not have had. So 2 keys to working as a historian with these sources are context and corroboration. What comes to mind when you hear those two words, context and corroboration? Those are two things that I'm going to be really diving into today. First, I want to talk about how historians, the steps that we take to go through a source and evaluate it and interpret it more specifically. And these are steps that I have learned from my colleagues who have studied how historians do their work, as well as my colleagues who have studied how to teach our students how to do this work of a historian. So how do we use historical evidence? How do we evaluate it, interpret it, and analyze it? Well, the very first thing we do before we even start reading it is locate the source in where it came from in the past. And sometimes we call this sourcing or sourcing this evidence, this piece of evidence. We ask questions such as who or what produced it? Where is it coming from? When did they produce it? The particularities of place and time are very important in history, so we want to ask when was this produced because that will help us locate that source within the time period. Also, we ask why. Why is this person or why is this document created? What is the purpose behind this? That will tell us a lot about the intended audience and the information that is coming from this source. And you can see that that's the last question. What is the audience of this source? So if you can think about a source for a moment that you've used recently in family history and ask these questions of that source, it can help you think about all of the different aspects of this source. Now, once you've done that, hopefully you have thought a little bit more about what you do as you look at a source. Sometimes these things come naturally to us. We look at a source, we see, okay, we automatically think, who is it? Where did it come from? When did it come from? And we do those things just as second nature. But if we take some time to think about them a little bit more, then it can open up some new ideas and new ways of looking at the source. Now, once we've located a source, we want to think about other things surrounding the source that will help us understand the source. And this is what we call contextualization in history. So you want to think about, again, where and when did this source get produced? Who did that? What is it about, again, the place and the time that this source was produced that helps us understand what this source is about? You can look there on the screen, the geography, chronology, even the social values and the culture surrounding this source. So for example, when we think about reports of people being married in the early 1800s, in Joseph Smith's time, when people were married at that time, women were married much younger than they are today. So those sorts of historical understandings can really help us understand what's happening in the source and to our ancestors when we're looking at them in family history. Now, again, all of this comes before we even start looking at the information more closely in the source. And usually we'll have to look at this information. Maybe there's a journal or a diary. Maybe it's just a vital record. But all of these things, the next step is that we do a close reading of the language and the meaning in the source. So then once we have the idea of the context, we can dive in. So you can see how context is really important in those first few steps. So that's when once you've had an idea of the context, then you can go to the close reading of the language and the meaning. Now, once we've gained that information, and oftentimes I tell my students, write down these keywords, phrases, take note of them. The next step is to analyze this source. What information can we get from it? How does it contribute to the information that we are building about this question we have about our ancestors or certain aspects of the past? And the next step, the last step, is corroboration. So that means we need to go and check this source against other sources to check the information, the validity, to bring everything together and see the story that is emerging. So context, those first two steps on the slide there, And then corroboration, that a very important part of this these steps moving through this historical evidence. They are important in interpreting and building our understanding of the past and our family history. All of these things are important. Oral history itself, as an example, is rarely done in isolation. When we do an oral history interview, we then go and check it with other written sources, with other interviews that we do, with background information that we can gain from work that other historians have done. And we can also use visual sources. We can bring photographs in. We can interview, again, multiple people. We can go to the site of these historical events or where people lived. All right, so I want to talk more about how important context is for doing family history. Understanding the broader context, as you can see from the slide, it's really important for those first few steps of evaluating historical evidence, but it's also very important in family history. You might not think that I'm writing a history book that I'm going to publish for all the world to read. You're just doing your family history, but it's really important to understand those family members in your past by understanding their context. Understanding the broader context can determine the questions you ask, how you locate your family members in history, what explains their movements, where they go, at what point, what decisions they make, the outside forces that are determining what choices they have, and where what they choose for their livelihoods, when they marry, all of these cultural practices that you may see them doing in the past. Political and social issues may also come into play to understanding them. So, how do we understand this context? Well, there are a number of things that we can do. One is that we can read local and national histories. There is a lot of work that historians have done to bring all of these things together, so you can dive into that. Perhaps there are some documentaries that explain certain aspects of maybe national history that was important in your ancestor's life. And you can also look at local museums. So there are a lot of ways that we learn this history. It's not just in written works, but in museums, film, TV, other aspects. You can also go to websites, and I have here on the slide, just when I was creating this slideshow, I picked the day on the day that I was creating the slides, and I went to history.com and I looked at this day in history. We often see these things when maybe in the media, in the news, they highlight certain things that happened in the past on this particular day in history. And you can see there on January 17th in 1893, there was the overthrowing of the Hawaiian monarchy. So if you're looking for people who lived in Hawaii at that time, that would be a really important event to look into. In 1945, the Soviets capture Warsaw. So understanding what's happening in January of 1945 during World War II, what might that have had an impact on the people that we are looking for, whether it's in the United States or Russia or Poland? Other things, 1966, NBC greenlights The Monkees. So this is some cultural history that you can understand what maybe your family members were watching on TV in the 1960s. And that could maybe help you understand, again, what decisions they make, the time that they spent at home with their family, and other aspects of their life, which are really important for understanding these individuals in the past. Now, family history is social history. When we talk about social history, we talk about the history of people the ordinary, everyday person. And so it is important for us to understand that social history for understanding people in the past and families. All right, now I'm going to share some examples from my own family history, a couple of excerpts, and we're going to look at what we might understand better if we knew the context surrounding this family history as examples. So I want to start off with an excerpt from an interview I did with my dad's cousin, Norma Jean Hadfield Meekum. And She was living with her family near Elko, Nevada. I didn't get quite the exact years, but this should be in the 1980s. And she told the story of an accident that her girls were in early March in Elko, Nevada. So I want to first read what she said in the interview that I did with her and think about, as we're reading through that, what are some things about the broader context that you might have questions about? And then we'll highlight a couple of those. So she said in the interview, after they were seriously injured in this snowmobile bus accident, quote, "They got life flight there from Elko, Nevada, and there was only room for the girls to be on the life flight, so we had to drive. We took Lane and Jeanette's four-wheel drive truck and headed for Salt Lake, across Wendover and the Salt Flat. And it was one of the worst times. The snow was blowing across the roads. There were semis in the brink. There were cars piled up, and we're just crawling across and not knowing whether our girls were alive or not. That was a very long night. And when we got to Salt Lake, they had stabilized them quite well, and Lara was in surgery with her broken leg. Mary was in intensive care." And she goes on to tell about what happened there. So we have just this short excerpt. What might we understand better if we knew the context? Well, let me point some things out. First of all, knowing where Elko, Nevada is and what healthcare resources there might have been there in the 1980s is really important. And in fact, a little bit more of this story is that they were actually living 50 miles north of Elko. So it's a kind of a remote place. And to get in such a serious accident in that area, the one daughter, Lara, her leg was broken in a way that the bone was actually coming out. It's a little gruesome. And so and Mary was unconscious. So this was pretty serious. And this commercial bus was driving by when they got in the accident. And so she talked about life flight. Well, it's important to know that, and to Salt Lake, Elko being remote in a way from some major healthcare facilities, they needed to be flown to Salt Lake City, which was a major health resource in the region, in the Mountain West region. And so especially in that time period, that was really important. So they were rushed to the hospital in Elko, and then they flew in a helicopter. Now, the other thing that is important to note here is that Elko is about 230 miles away from Salt Lake City. This is early March, but a big snowstorm came through. And so usually the drive from Elko to Salt Lake today would take 3.5 hours. But you can see the description of the snow that Norma Jean gave and all of the anxiety that would have come with that. They're driving along. This is the 1980s. Very few people had cell phones at that time. So they're making this drive, which took more than 3.5 hours, not sure what's happening with their daughters the entire time. And so understanding that helps us to really gain more empathy for that situation and to understand how difficult that would have been for them. Now, one of the things that happened in this story is that when Norma Jean arrived at the hospital and they were worried about Mary during the night, she was having some seizures. She called her Uncle Eldon, which was her father's younger brother. And her Uncle Eldon was living in Salt Lake at the time. And he came and gave Mary a priesthood blessing. So that was an important part of this story as well. And the important part of Norma Jean telling about her blessings. So the next thing, I wanted to bring Uncle Eldon into this story, and we're going to now look at an excerpt from his obituary. He passed away in 2010, and this was part of his obituary. Now, it's just giving some facts, and perhaps you're going to see this in the history that you are doing. And so we're going to look at some of these facts, but think about, again, the broader context, how that could really help us understand the situation better if we did a little bit more research into this place and time. So you see there, Eldon Edward Hadfield, or E squared as he liked to be called, was born on October 15th, 1916 at Grouse Creek, Utah. He was born to William and Grace Jorgensen Hadfield in the family's one-room log cabin, with Grandma Mary Shaw Hadfield acting as midwife. He grew up enjoying and experiencing carefree days with his siblings. As his schooling at Grouse Creek came to a close, he attended Logan Senior High School with siblings Ronald and Merle. While attending school in Logan, he lived with his grandpa and Grandma Jorgensen. Now, the family thought that this was important information to include. So that's a clue that this is important information that shaped his life, right? His early life. What are some other things that if we knew about Grouse Creek, Utah, and that time period that might give us some better understanding of Eldon Hadfield's life? Well, first of all, Grouse Creek, Utah, it's a small town, ranching and farming community north of the Great Salt Lake. It today is even smaller than it was during that time. But at this time, some families had decided that this might be a great area to do some dry farming. And so when Eldon Hadfield's parents and grandparents came, his father came from England, and his grandmother, Mary Shaw Hadfield, was part of that. They came and they decided to try their luck there in Grouse Creek. So that's why a new settlement, they lived in a one-room log cabin. And you can see his grandmother, Mary Shaw Hadfield, acted as a midwife. Now, you might not know that she actually was trained as part of a program that the church had instituted during that time to train more women in Utah to act as midwives and even doctors. And so there's a fascinating, rich history behind just that one sentence that we can understand. And if we learn a lot more about Mary Shaw Hadfield as well as more people in the family. He grew up in this what seemed like an idyllic childhood. So why did he have to leave Grouse Creek? Well, if we understand what place Grouse Creek was, it was small enough that they had a rural school there with all the grades meeting together. But once they hit 10th grade, they had to go and finish high school at other schools. Now, most of the students who were in Grouse Creek ended up going within the same school district to Brigham City, which was in the Box Elder School District. So you might learn about that and then again wonder, why did he go to Logan? Well, there are some clues there. He attended Logan High School with his siblings who had gone to live with his Jorgensen grandparents. And so that was their connection to Logan there. The Hadfields, they were in Grouse Creek, and Grace Jorgensen, her family was in Logan. So that explains the movements. Now, sometimes you might know the context and not some of the facts, but the context can help you uncover some of these facts. All right, so once you've gone through these sources, you've learned the context, you're starting to understand these sources better, how can you corroborate this evidence? That's what we're going to spend more time in the rest of this session. What does corroboration mean? It means that you check against other sources. What do other sources say about these things? In oral history, we check oral histories with other oral histories. So we interview a number of people. We want to get a variety of perspectives, different versions of the same story. We consider authority and credibility when we do that. So you don't want, if you have somebody who, like Norma Jean, she was there when her daughters went to the hospital. She could tell us that part. Her daughters would be even better sources because they could tell us what actually happened in the accident and their experience. But if we interviewed Eldon in that sense, if we had had a chance to interview him, he wouldn't have as much information about the accident, but he could give us more information about what he felt when he gave the priesthood blessing to Mary. So we have to be careful as we are looking at these different perspectives to weigh the validity, the credibility that each person had. And then if you were to ask me about this story, I would have much less credibility because I've only heard it from Norma Jean. So all of those things come into play. We need to be careful to weigh those credible sources appropriately. But we do compare these stories, and if everybody is remembering correctly, or If we have these different perspectives and they all confirm some information, I think we can be pretty sure that that is the truth. We also check written sources. And you can see on this slide, I have a number of pictures of things from the research that I did in both my first book and my second book. So I have a picture of women I interviewed, some documents, official documents. I have even an artifact and some photographs that you can see. So the people, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but you can see how all of those things together can help us understand that. So in family history, you have vital records. You have other family history records, such as journals, diaries, letters, newspapers. You might have census records, directories. So all of these things, and even visiting sites of places, can be really helpful to checking this information you're getting from different places. So I want to go through some examples of this. First of all, here are some written records that I used in my own research. On the left, you can see a report. It's a budget from this organization, Sprocas, and that's from 1973. And you can see listed there the salaries, what people were earning. Now, when I was looking at that salary list, I also was interviewing some people who had been paid as part of working for this organization at a much lower level. And when the woman who I interviewed told me what she had earned per month, it seemed like that was pretty high compared to what I saw these other people earning. The director, the technical director, these other people you can see in the budget. And so what I ended up doing is thinking, well, perhaps she was thinking about the salary in contemporary times when she was telling me. So luckily during the interview, I asked her, what did that salary mean for you? How did it change your life? So I had some other things that she told me, such as before I started working with this organization, I just had to get the little food that I could. But when I started working for this organization, I could go and buy things that my family wanted. So these are ways that, again, you can see how the written record, you can weigh that against other records like oral history interviews. On the right on this slide, you can see a report from a clinic that I found with different statistics about what was happening in the clinic, the cases they saw, how successful they were. And as I was interviewing a number of interviewing a number of nurses, many of them said that they did not have a death in childbirth. Now, this was pretty incredible for me because these nurses were working in clinics like the Pilton Clinic you see here. They didn't have electricity. They often didn't have running water, or they didn't have enough linens. And so these were difficult circumstances for these nurses to be working under. So I wondered, how did they do this? And is it correct that they told me this? Now, you can see how I was corroborating the evidence with other oral history interviews. So I interviewed over 60 women for this, and many of them working in these areas. But I checked as many of these records as I could, and indeed, the nurses were telling me something that was reflected in the written record. I showed these pictures and this artifact on the previous slide as well, and you can see here that I had a brochure that was explaining what this leatherwork factory was producing in a village, which was pretty remarkable for the time. This was something that the activists I studied built in order to help people in this village gain a living or earn some money. And so you can see in the photographs, the one on the top, there's a woman who's putting some things together. It looks like some of these little wallets that you can see in the bottom picture. And even the caption there tells us a little bit about that. Now, when I interviewed the women that I showed on the previous slide, this one mom, Sarah Papu, she brought this wallet. And so I could see the finished product that she had kept all these years. So I had an actual artifact, an object that was reflected in the photograph and these women could tell me about. And the other great thing is with these photographs, on the bottom right-hand side of the bottom photograph, the woman there, Mrs. Mamase, she was one that I interviewed. And so she could see herself in the photograph and explain to me what was going on. And I showed them other photographs to help them remember who was working at this leatherwork factory and to spark some memories, more explanations. So photographs, again, with oral history, very important, as well as these artifacts. So it's pretty exciting when all of these things come together. So how does this work? How can this work with family history? Well, I would like to end the session by talking about a story from the other side of my family, from my mother's family. And this was a story. This is a story about how we figured out more information about my mother's great-grandfather named Jerome Patton. So I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures here and explain how all of these sources work together. So my mother and her siblings were looking for information about Jerome Patton's second wife. My grandmother, my mom's mom, had done a lot of family history and talked to a number of her relatives. So these are some stories, some ideas. And she had left a note in a book that she'd handed off to her children to say that her grandfather had married again. And so my mother and her siblings were looking for this second wife because they wanted to do the temple work for her and also to seal their great-grandfather to someone in that marriage covenant. Now, as they were looking, they found some cemetery information on his death certificate. So we found the death certificate. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in Attleboro, Massachusetts. And this was confirmed, again, corroborated by some information that a cousin had given my mom's sister through an email. So we had enough information to take us to the next step. There was also you can see on the top left in the slide that there was a letter to my grandmother, Yvonne, from an aunt in 1963 who said that they were going to try to get a gravestone up for their grandfather for Memorial Day. So there was some evidence that this was something the family had considered, but they still needed to confirm this. So looking at these different pieces of evidence, at this point, we've got stories, we've got notes, we've got cemetery information, and a letter. So what is the next step? Okay, we wanted to find this grave site to see if there's any information about who Jerome Patton had married. So they tried to find a grave, this stone, and they confirmed that he was buried in this Woodlawn Cemetery, but they didn't have the picture of the headstone. So I was going to a conference in Boston, and I went to the cemetery to see if I could find it. So again, visiting the site, going to some of these sites. I saw the cemetery map, which is pictured on this slide, and I worked with the people who are working at the cemetery sextons, and we figured out where it could be, and we went there. And at that point, it was in the fall, and some things had been overgrown, and so we couldn't find the headstone, but we thought perhaps in the spring, maybe it would be a better time. And so we left it there, and my mom got in touch with the sexton who had worked there for a number of years, knew the cemetery very well. And so he thought that there was, it was in this area, but we weren't sure. But then the sexton retired, and a new sexton came in, and he thought there wasn't even a grave. So then we were wondering, where is this person? And we also thought if there's no headstone, maybe my mom and her siblings thought that they would want to put a headstone up. So some other family stories come into play here because of some stories that about Jerome Patton's relationship with his family. There had been a divorce. The children didn't have a good relationship with him, and so they thought perhaps they didn't put a headstone up on purpose because they didn't have good feelings. And so my mother and her family, they wanted to put a headstone up to kind of reconcile with the family. So this became an important project to them. Now, as all of this was going on, my mom realized that she had a photograph of her grandfather, Jerome Patton's son, and daughter at visiting a cemetery. And so she got the photograph. And in the photograph, you can see right in the middle, there they are standing at his grave. And she thought there must be some clues here. So they started looking more closely. She contacted the retired sexton, and working with all of them, they discovered the retired sexton said, "I know where that site is, and we can go and find it." So we sent another cousin of mine to go and visit the cemetery to see if they could find this site. And there's also in family history an element of the spirit working as well. You can see the picture on the right bottom corner. My cousin is standing there. What ended up happening is they went to the site where the picture had told them it should be, and my cousin's daughter walked over to this bush, and there was the headstone and the grave hidden under this overgrown bush. And so they uncovered it, and they discovered this information, and they actually found out that it had the wrong birth date. And so they were able to fix that and put a new headstone up. So this was an exciting thing for my family, and I think a great way to illustrate the importance of corroboration and the way that you need to look at all different sources to bring them together and ask questions of these sources. What time was this letter written? What information does it give, and what information might have come afterwards? And what information did this aunt give to her niece? And maybe could have there been some more information there that these people didn't know or that was missing because of their position in the family? All of those questions come into place, and all of these contexts. And there's a lot more that I could tell you about what we learned about the context of these family members in the past that helped us understand why they moved when they did, and the relationship between Massachusetts and all of that gravestone. So I hope that you will take these exercises that we've done together and learn more about the context and how it can help you and inform you about looking for your ancestors in the past and others in the past that you may be searching for, and then help you find all the information that you can about them.